$3.5 trillion. That's how much money is hidden right now in offshore accounts, which is more than the entire GDP of the United Kingdom. Embarrassing, I know. Now, this $3.5 trillion, we know it's there. We know who put it there. We know which banks helped them do it. And we know which lawyers built the hiding places. We have all this information, and we know all of this because the files, not the Epstein files, the Panama Papers, a different set of files, 37 million leaked documents across 3 separate leaks, the biggest exposure of financial secrecy in the history of humans, modern history. These are the files before the files. And one woman used these files to expose the most powerful people on her island, and they killed her for it. The woman's name was Daphne Galizia, and she lived on Malta, which is a small Mediterranean island, smaller than most American cities, with a population of about 500,000 people. She was a mother of 3 who studied archaeology at the University of Malta and wasn't a journalist in any traditional sense, but she ran a blog called Running Commentary from her kitchen table, writing about corruption in Maltese politics. So she's writing about corruption on this tiny island of Malta. The Mediterranean area in general is just known for its extreme corruption and long history of organized crime. And Daphne was writing about this corruption with a level of detail that made the country's most powerful people genuinely afraid of her. On a good day, 400,000 people read her blog, sometimes as many as 1 million, which is more than every Maltese newspaper combined in a country of nearly 500,000. Politico called her a one-woman WikiLeaks. And for a long time, the people that she wrote about tried everything to make her stop. In 1996, someone slit her dog's throat and left the dog on her doorstep. That same year, her front door was doused in fuel and set on fire. 10 years later, in 2006, someone piled tires against the back door of her house and lit them while her entire family was asleep inside. 2 more dogs were killed after that, 1 poisoned, 1 shot. She received threats by phone, by letter, by email, nearly every day for years. And at the time of her death, she was facing 48 active lawsuits, almost all of them filed by members of parliament trying to bury her in legal fees. Pilatus Bank, one of the institutions she was investigating, sued her for $40 million, and she never stopped. And yes, this is all real, and it is all genuinely insane. By the way, she didn't start her blog in 1996. She started her career as a news reporter for the Sunday Times of Malta, and then moved to a columnist, and eventually just grew and grew and grew. She was renowned. Regardless of everything they did to try and stop her, she did not stop. And in February of 2016, months before the Panama Papers became the biggest news story in the world at that time, Daphne published something on her blog that nobody outside Malta was really paying attention to. She reported that 2 of Malta's most powerful officials had secret companies registered in Panama. Keith Schembri, the Prime Minister's chief of staff, owned a shell company called Tillgate Inc., and Conrad Mitzi, the energy minister, owned one called Hernville Inc. Both were set up by the same Panamanian law firm, and both were connected to trusts in New Zealand designed to hide the real owners. Now, I mentioned Panama Papers. That was huge news back in 2016, 2017, and it still occasionally makes headlines again. And if you are well-read, you've probably heard of it and you probably know a good bit about it. But if not, don't feel ashamed. This connects with everything else bad that's been going on in the world. These are the same people implicated in all the other stuff that is even happening now. It is a big, gigantic club, and we are not in it, unfortunately. I mean, fortunately, that club. I digress. Daphne is reporting on this, and when the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, published the Panama Papers 2 months later, everything Daphne had already reported was all in all confirmed, and it turned out to be part of something far bigger than Malta, so she kept digging. By February of 2017, she traced a Dubai company called 17 Black that was set to funnel up to $2 million to Schembri and Mitzi's Panamanian companies. She connected it to a $510 million Euro gas plant deal to Azerbaijan's state oil company and to a Maltese businessman who was the primary contact between the energy consortium and the government officials overseeing the contract. She was mapping the entire corruption triangle live. She was mapping the businessmen, paying the politicians through offshore structures, and she was doing it in public on a blog, and she'd already had multiple of her dogs murdered. The balls Genuinely, it is incredibly impressive. The bravery or courage or whatever, I have no idea really how to quantify it. But tragically, on October 16th, 2017 at 2:35 in the afternoon, Daphne published her last blog post. The final line read, "There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate." 30 minutes later, she walked out of her house and got into her little car, and there was a bomb under the driver's seat. The trigger was an electronic device fitted with a SIM card, and the detonation code was this. It was sent by SMS from a cabin cruiser sitting offshore, and the explosion killed her instantly and threw her car 80 meters into a field. Her son Matthew heard the blast from inside the house, and he ran down the hill towards the smoke and later testified in court. "I looked down and there were my mother's body parts all around me." She was only 53 years old at the time. Daphne's investigation was only a piece of something much, much larger. In early 2015, a journalist named Bastian Obermeier at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of Germany's biggest newspapers, received an encrypted message from a Panamanian law firm that said, "Hello, this is John Doe. Interested in data?" And John Doe, whoever they were, was someone inside a Panamanian law firm called Mossack Fonseca, and they wanted to hand over everything. No face-to-face meetings, encrypted channels only, and their reasoning was extremely simple. "My life is in danger," they said. And Bastian's colleague at the paper, Süddeutsche Zeitung, a man by the name of Friedrich Obermeier, basically the exact same name, but a completely different person, he was on paternity leave when the messages started coming in. And when Bastian told him what they said, the other Obermeier said, "I was already in," which is awesome. I love a good investigative journalist. Over the next 13 months, John Doe transferred 11.5 million documents from inside Mossack Fonseca's servers, consisting of emails, contacts, passport scans, and internal memos spanning 4 decades of the firm's operations. Bastian even secured the hard drives with glitter nail polish on the screws so he would know if anyone had tampered with them. The two journalists, Obermeier and Obermeier, realized they couldn't process this alone, so they brought in the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ, which we mentioned earlier. The ICIJ is a Washington-based nonprofit that coordinates cross-border investigations with newsrooms around the world. For 13 months, 370 journalists from over 100 media outlets in 80 countries analyzed the files in total secrecy before publishing a single word. That is incredibly impressive. A private intelligence operation against the most powerful people in the world. On April 3rd, 2016, the Panama Papers went public. 214,000 offshore shell companies, 140 politicians from more than 50 countries. Vladimir Putin's name wasn't in the documents directly, but his closest associates had channeled roughly $2 billion through offshore accounts. And the man at the center of it was a classical cellist named Sergei Roldygin, one of Putin's oldest friends and the godfather of his eldest daughter. One of Roldygin's shell companies, Sandalwood Continental, had at least $650 million in credit lines. The names, by the way, are so generic and bad for these shell companies, it's clearly illegal. Iceland's prime minister had secretly held personal investments in the same banks that collapsed and bankrupted his country during the 2008 financial crisis, meaning he had a financial stake in the institutions his own government was supposed to be overseeing, which sounds illegal, because it is, but it's also just normal. This dipshit resigned within 48 hours of publication. Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and his family owned 21 London properties worth more than £32 million through 8 offshore companies. Pakistan's Supreme Court disqualified him from office and for a time banned him from politics entirely. I wish we could ban people from politics here. Just, they made an assload of money manipulating the stock market. You're banned from politics, dipshit. You. Also, you're getting tarred and feathered. I would love that. I say we bring that back. A lot of people say public executions. I say that's extreme and Christ is king, and I don't want to see people die, to be honest with you, but I wouldn't mind seeing him get humiliated. A month after the Panama Paper publication, John Doe, the source of these leaks, wrote an 1,800-word manifesto, which is very fascinating with a few very interesting quotes, such as, "Income inequality is one of the defining issues of our time, and the next revolution will be digitized." The identity of John Doe is still unknown. So, the Panama Papers. It implies it's all kind of under one roof. They all come from Panama. It's all from one law firm, Mossack Fonseca, or whatever There's 214,000 shell companies. They can't all do this. Somebody had to make them. Somebody had to run the evil factory. Who's the evil guy? Dr. Evil. Well, we'll get to that. The firm was called Mossack Fonseca and was founded in Panama City in 1977 by two men whose backgrounds will tell you everything you need to know about the offshore world. Jürgen Mossack was the son of a man named Erhard Mossack, who served in the Waffen-SS during World War II as a member of the Totenkopf Division, which translates to Death's Head, which was one of the most notorious SS units in World War II. It was originally formed from concentration camp guards. After the war, Erhard offered his services to U.S. Army intelligence as an informant, then moved his family to Panama in the early 1960s, where he later offered to spy for the CIA on communist activity in Cuba. Classic. All right, guys? His son, Jürgen, got a law degree in Panama, started his own practice, and merged with a novelist and politician named Ramon Fonseca in 1986. Fonseca was a two-time winner of Panama's National Literary Prize, who also served as minister counselor to the Panamanian president. So, pretty relevant guy in Panama, I guess. At some point, he told Mossack, "Together we have created a monster." That's good. At least they're honest. By the time of the leak, the firm had created roughly 300,000 shell companies across 44 countries and had more than 500 banks as clients, 500 employees, and was billing $42 million a year in services. An internal memo admitted that 95% of their work was selling vehicles to avoid taxes, and they couldn't identify 70 to 75% of their own company's owners. Huh? That seems illegal as well. It's 'cause it is! What's the deal with all these crimes and shit? A shell company, by the way, if you don't know, is a company that doesn't do anything. It has no employees, no office, no product. It exists on paper for one purpose: to put a wall between money and the person who actually owns that money. At Mossack Fonseca, you could set up one for about $1,000 in under 48 hours. For a few hundred more dollars, they'd supply a nominee director, a person who signs as the official director on all the paperwork, so the real owner's name never appears. It's pure and complete, utter obfuscation. Evil! A woman named Leticia Montoya appeared as director of 10,967 companies, and she lived in a tiny house in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Panama. That's pretty epic. By the way, from the information I could find online, she apparently made $900 a month. So you take this complete and total exploitation, and then you just layer it, basically. It starts in Panama. You have Company A. Company A owns Company B, which is in the British Virgin Islands. This company then owns Company C in the Caymans, which this company then holds a Swiss bank account. By the time you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you have no idea who the owns what, where anything is gone, and there's no trail because these entities are not required legally to communicate with each other or disclose anything. If anyone were to try to trace who actually owns the money, they would be chasing paper through 4 jurisdictions in which none of them are required to share information with each other, which means they won't. Take the British Virgin Islands, for example. There's 40,000 people there and more than 600,000 registered companies, which works out to about 15 companies per person. Hey man, a lot of entrepreneurs in there. Every single person has 15 companies, even babies? What? That's awesome. The Cayman Islands has 69,000 residents and manages $8.5 trillion in assets. Hey man, that's pretty cool. This is also in seas. In fact, it's in Delaware. At 1209 North Orange Street in Wilmington, Delaware, if you were to send a letter there, you'd be sending a letter to the registered address of nearly 300,000 companies as well, which is epic. Mossack Fonseca even paid 80% of the entire national budget of Niue, a Pacific island with fewer than 2,000 people, in exchange for giving them exclusive rights to register shell companies there. By the year 2000, Niue had 6,000 shells, 3 for every man, woman, and even the babies on that island. US banks eventually caught on and tried to make people follow the rules in 2003 when they banned dollar transfers to Niue. That was in 2003. Mossack Fonseca moved the operation to Samoa. So it's extremely up, and it is a gigantic system that spans the entire world. And Daphne found one corner of the system, but the Panama Papers were just the beginning because it happened again a year later. On November 5th, 2017, less than 3 weeks after Daphne was killed, the same two German journalists who broke the Panama Papers, Obermeyer and Obermeyer, received a second leak. The Paradise Papers came from a different firm, which was a Bermuda-based offshore law firm called Appleby that's been around for over 100 years and operates across Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man, and Hong Kong. 13.4 million documents, 96 media partners, 67 countries. And the names in these files were different. Queen Elizabeth II had roughly $13 million invested offshore, including a previously undisclosed stake in a Cayman Islands fund that controlled Bright House, a rent-to-own company that had been criticized for exploiting poor families and vulnerable people. God save the Queen! Any chance I can just take my pants down, spread my ass cheeks, and just shit on British royalty, I gladly will, dude. I grew up in Virginia. Do you know what it's like having a woman on your flag with her titty out, foot on the neck of a tyrant? Oh, it's awesome. I love it. Anyways, Appleby had $252 billion parked offshore. Nike, the shoe company that virtue signals every single day on Twitter, had routed $3.86 billion in trademark royalties through a subsidiary in Bermuda, which means they're evil as f. You can't do this type of shit and not be evil. You just can't. If you go through this much effort to obfuscate billions of dollars, dude. We're not talking like, hey man, I got 40 bucks, and if I send my 40 bucks, somebody's gonna steal 20 of it, and I'm gonna be It's like, I have $100 billion. I can't even count that high or think about that. And then I don't want someone to take 12% of it. Dude, seriously, consider suicide or what, something. Like, what is going on with all these entities and people? I don't get it. Jarvis, more alcohol! And buried in the Appleby files, by the way, all my homies hate Appleby, was a name that wouldn't really mean much to most people in 2017, but would mean a lot if you waited 2 years, to which he died mysteriously in his jail cell. That name is Jeffrey Epstein. 4 years later, on October 3rd, 2021, the ICIJ published the Pandora Papers. This time, the leak didn't come from one firm, it came from 14 different offshore service providers across multiple countries, which meant this wasn't about one bad actor or one rogue law firm anymore, one John Doe SS officer fella. It's kind of getting a little harder and harder to be an evil piece of shit without people being like, hey, I work for a company that's got a bunch of evil pieces of shit in it. Here you go, journalists. This is just taking advantage of the system and trying to hide and obfuscate money by breaking the law and being in a club that nobody else is in, which that's how it all starts. You know, that's how you start here by being Dr. Evil, piece of shit, and then somehow Dr. Evil really isn't even that evil. And then you start to become like Epstein and all the other rich people we see and have to deal with on a daily basis. What's up with being rich and evil, though? Why is that a thing? $1 billion. So we got 12 million documents, hundreds of journalists, potentially the largest journalistic collaboration in history to expose current, former world leaders, Russian oligarchs, King Abdullah of Jordan, who had spent more than $106 million on luxury real estate in the United States of America and the United Kingdom, including $68 million on 3 mansions in Malibu alone, all routed through offshore companies, dude. King Abdullah, dude. Taking advantage of the system, dude. Suck these big fingers, bro. I mean, these are normal size. Tony Blair and his wife bought an $8.8 million building in central London by purchasing the British Virgin Islands company that held the property, which saved them $400,000 in stamp duty. Rules for thee, not for me. Hey, guess what I say? Hang in the streets. Hang out in the streets. I'm not saying hang people in the streets. I'm saying tar and feather them. Hang out in the streets. Let's get in the streets and let's rise up. Yes! All jokes aside, I'm joking way too much in this video. I apologize, but it really freaks me out. And instead of saying Jarvis, more alcohol, I like to express myself because I feel triggered and I just have to like get it out, you know? I think tarring and feathering would solve so many problems. If you just like, you make one tiny little money related mistake that takes advantage of anybody you're supposed to represent in government. Anybody, if you're in government and you're supposed to represent the people, you make a tiny little mistake and it's proven, you get tarred and feathered, dude. You get your weenie pulled in public and it's on TV And it's on Twitch. It's a Twitch live stream, and we can send bits, and then more tar and feathers go on you. Nobody loses. Literally nobody loses. It would just be pure and total humiliation. I would love that. So anyways, Tony Blair, piece of shit. That stamp tax, that's the tax you normally pay when you buy property in the United Kingdom. Pretty epic. That building currently now houses Sherry Blair's law firm. That's his daughter, I guess. I'm not gonna fact check that. The president of Azerbaijan had purchased $44.7 million in London real estate through shell companies for his 11-year-old son, all paid in cash. I'm sure he'll use that. So after processing all of this, what happened? What were the consequences? Some people were fired. Over the past 10 years, governments worldwide have recovered about $2 billion in back taxes, which sounds somewhat significant, but if you compare that to the 3.55 trillion that's still sitting in offshore accounts right now, it kind of seems like a joke, because that's less than 1%. So honestly, really embarrassing. So what happened to Mossack Fonseca, the firm that started all of this? Both founders were arrested and charged with money laundering. Of course, trial lasted 85 hours across 8 years. And in June 2024, all 28 defendants were found. They were acquitted. The judge ruled that the evidence from the firm's servers had not been gathered in line with due process, which means the files were obtained through a hack, not a legal investigation, so none of it could be used in court. Are you joking me, dude? All 28 defendants walked free. Raymond Fonseca died of pneumonia before the verdict came down. Rest in piss. I cannot believe the level of corruption there. That is crazy. We have a lot of evidence, but the evidence was acquired through a leak, a hack, which means it's bad guy evidence, and I'm the good guy. I don't have any money in offshore accounts. I don't have any money in offshore accounts. I'm just all about honesty and the truth. And if you leak any information, even if it's true, if you leak it and you get it, because the person doesn't want to give it, if they would have given us the evidence, send them to jail. But they have to give us the evidence first through a legal process, like handing it over, like saying, I've been funneling money for a lot of rich people around the world. Oh yeah? Jail, then. What the dude? It's so frustrating. It makes me really angry. It makes me want to just, shit in my chair. Pissed off right now. The Paradise Papers, the second leak, named Jeffrey Epstein as chairman of something called Liquid Funding Limited, a Bermuda-based shell company. Liquid Funding owed $6.7 billion almost entirely in mortgage-backed securities, which are bundles of home loans repackaged as investments, which were the toxic financial instruments that triggered the 2008 financial crash. Talked about it before on the channel, but they fired me up too. Dude, and all these people, man, come on. And Appleby, the firm that set it up, was the same type of offshore law firm operating in the same jurisdictions as the one that Daphne had been investigating in Malta. Bear Stearns owned 40% of the equity, and the other 60% has never been identified still to this day. One of the company's directors, a man named Marcus Klug, later said, there was neither a physical board meeting or a call between board members. He also said, I never met him, in regard to Epstein. So, you never went to his island? Sure hope not. Wouldn't want to seem like an evil guy. Epstein chaired Liquid Funding from November 2001 to at least March of 2007, which overlaps almost exactly with the years his trafficking operation was running. And when Bear Stearns collapsed in 2008, JP Morgan acquired it with $30 billion in Federal Reserve backing. So our tax money, well, not mine, I was 12 years old, but 1 month later, Moody's reported that Liquid Funding's $6.7 billion in debts had been paid in full. No one has ever publicly explained where that money came from, and JP Morgan was simultaneously the security trustee for Liquid Funding and the acquirer of Bear Stearns, meaning they were on both sides of that transaction. Liquid Funding was just one node of this web of evil nodes. Independent forensic analysis of Epstein's finances has now mapped 694 separate entities totaling $6.4 billion. JP Morgan processed 4,725 suspicious transactions tied to Epstein worth $1.08 billion. while he was alive, which I've talked about this before, I apologize if this is rehashing, but it's very important to just remember this. There are entities that operate on a different playing field than just normal, regular people. While Epstein was alive, they'd flagged $4.3 million of transactions. After his death, they retroactively flagged nearly 300 times that amount, which means the compliance system that was supposed to catch this only started working after he's like, oh, Epstein's a bad guy? Oh, let's actually make our shit work. JP Morgan settled with Epstein's victims for $290 million. So when JP Morgan reaches out to me, I don't respond. All right, guys? When they send me a champagne flute for Christmas somehow, when they're like, oh, we can handle your money, I'd rather pull it out of banks and bury it in my yard than I can't. It makes me feel so much rage, dude. I can't go to the bank without starting to tell the tellers who have no involvement in any of this. I'm like, hey, you know about Epstein? The bank you work at? And this is Chase, JP Morgan. The bank you work at, it's evil. I only have some of my money with you because I have to. Because there's no other banks locally, because I live in a tiny little baby Texas town that have an online banking system. So I have to drive 40 minutes. What the man? God, that's so annoying. Appleby incorporated Epstein's shell company, and JP Morgan processed his money. The Bermuda and the US Virgin Islands hid his assets like these other people. The people that murdered Daphne in Malta, the royalty of the United Kingdom, they're all utilizing the same infrastructure that is only available to a very small group of people with a dick load of money. A dick shitload, if you will. Same playbook, guys. It's the same playbook. I'm very grateful that all of this information is just kind of public, and the internet is a free enough place to where we can research and we can inform ourselves and we can make decisions like, I don't want to work with this bank because of this track record, because of this. We have a lot of reasons to inform our decisions moving forward thanks to the internet. But do we have information on who killed Daphne? There was a Dubai company that Daphne traced in her last year. It was called 17 Black, and it was funneling money through a prime minister's chief of staff and the energy minister through the Panamanian shell companies. It was this company. We talked about it a little bit earlier. In November 2018, a year after Daphne's murder, a joint investigation by Reuters and the Times of Malta identified the owner of 17 Black. His name was Jorgen Fennick. He was the CEO of one of Malta's largest business empires, the Tumas Group, worth over 350 million euros. He was also a shareholder in the Electrogas Consortium, the company behind the 510 million euro gas plant deal that Daphne had been investigating. Fennick was the primary contact between the Energy Consortium and the government officials who oversaw the contract. He was paying the politicians who gave him the deal through offshore structures, and the woman exposing all of it was killed with a car bomb. So that seems pretty suspicious when you put it like that. The investigation into Daphne's murder took 2 years to finally reach him. 3 hitmen were arrested within weeks of the bombing, and one of them, Vince Muscat, eventually struck a plea deal in exchange for 15 years in the name of the person who ordered the hit. The other 2, the DiGiorgio brothers, were sentenced to 40 years in prison each. But the hitmen obviously were just the hitmen. They are tools, they're instruments. There was also a middleman, a taxi driver named Melvin Tema. Fennick gave Tema cash, and Tema passed it to the DiGiorgio brothers, and the total payment for the assassination was only 150,000 euros. That is, the hitman market is crazy. Just murdering and killing people for, that's a lot of money, sure, I guess, but I can't understand it, man. Her life is worth $150,000. It's crazy. It's dangerous to actually tell the truth, and it doesn't cost that much for the danger to be real. Anyways, a detail that finally cracked the case. Starting in 2018, Tuma began secretly recording his conversations with Fennick because he was afraid he would be the next one eliminated. And those recordings eventually became the prosecution's key evidence. In July 2020, just before Tuma was scheduled to be cross-examined in court, he was found at his home with knife wounds to his neck and chest. Police called it a suspected suicide attempt, but He survived and continued testifying. On November 20th, 2019, Jorgen Finnick was detained on his yacht as he was trying to leave Malta by boat. Within 6 days, the Maltese government completely collapsed. Keith Schembri, the prime minister's chief of staff, the man that Daphne had been investigating since 2016, resigned and was arrested for questioning. The energy minister, Conrad Mitzi, resigned that same day, and economy minister Chris Cardona suspended himself from the Labour Party. And on December 1st, Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, the man who had called Daphne irrelevant, announced that he would resign. Then finally, a 437-page public inquiry concluded in July of 2021 that the state should shoulder the responsibility for the assassination. So the government of Malta is responsible for the assassination of that journalist, Daphne. The inquiry found that the government had created what it called an atmosphere of impunity that allowed her killers to believe they'd face minimal consequences, and that whoever planned and carried out the assassination did so in the knowledge they would be protected, which means they are responsible. During the inquiry is when Muscat called Daphne irrelevant, and Mizzi refused to answer more than 100 questions. In 2024, Schembri was criminally charged with leaking information to the murder suspects, and Mizzi was charged with corruption in February of 2025. Muscat himself was charged with fraud and corruption in the privatization of 3 public hospitals, and all 3 are pleading not guilty, obviously. After Daphne's death, a ton of journalists from a ton of news organizations in 15 countries picked up her unfinished work through something called the Daphne Project, where they kept investigating the stories that she had been killed for, and the project won the 2019 European Press Prize. Also, her 3 sons created a foundation in her name, and Matthew, the one who found her body in that field, has become its director, and he is now a member of the ICIJ, which is the same organization that published the Panama Papers. And you can still read Daphne's blog today if you'd like. I mentioned earlier that it's very dangerous to tell the truth, and it doesn't cost that much to cause danger to people telling the truth. For example, the 150,000 euros, that is cheap. That's a house. You can kill somebody for a cheap house. Unfortunately, the murder of Daphne is not an uncommon thing. Her murder is not an outlying circumstance. Between 2003 and 2022, 1,668 journalists were killed worldwide, with an average of 80 a year. That's more than 1 a week, with a ton being killed in Palestine and Gaza over the last 2 years. For example, 2025 was the deadliest year on record for journalists, with 129 killed, 47 of them targeted murders, and not a single conviction. More journalists die investigating corruption and organized crime in countries technically at peace than journalists die covering actual wars. Anna Politkovskaya, a reporter for the independent Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta, spent years documenting what Russian forces were doing in Chechnya. Torture and disappearances and extrajudicial killings, the types of stories that no one else would touch. On October 7th, 2006, Putin's birthday, someone shot her 4 times in the elevator of her Moscow apartment. She'd written something once that reads fairly differently now. She said, "People sometimes pay with their lives for saying aloud what they think." The gunman eventually got life in prison, and who ordered the killing remains officially unknown 20 years later, which seems obvious. The Russians love killing people. All right, they love killing. I mean, so do we, though. Let's be real. Who killed Epstein? Epstein killed Epstein. Don't you know that's the official story that the FBI said that? Javier Valdez covered the drug cartels in Sinaloa for the better part of 2 decades, which made him one of the most respected and most endangered reporters in Mexico. On May 15th, 2017, he was shot 12 times outside the offices of his own newspaper in broad daylight. And the cartel boss linked to the murder, El Mini Lick, was eventually arrested in the United States and sentenced to 5 years for fentanyl trafficking, and he was never charged with Valdez's killing. Jan Kuciak was a 27-year-old investigative journalist in Slovakia, tracing connections between his country's political elite and the Italian 'Ndrangheta mafia. On February 21st, 2018, someone entered his home and shot him and his fiancée, Martina Kushnirova. His last article was published after his death, and his editors added a single line at the bottom. The article had no conclusion. The author never finished it. The suspected mastermind has now gone through 3 retrials and over 8 years. As of a few weeks ago, when I researched this video, no verdict has been held. I assume one hasn't happened since then either. We also have Jamal Khashoggi, an infamous case. He walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd, 2018 to pick up paperwork for his wedding, and audio captured inside the building recorded his last words. I have asthma, do not do it, you will suffocate me. US intelligence agencies later concluded that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally approved the operation, but MBS was never charged or sanctioned in any meaningful way. He eventually became prime minister, and now women can drive. In every one of these cases, the triggermen were caught, the people who gave the orders weren't. Which brings us back to Malta. Jürgen Finnick, the CEO behind the 350 million euro business empire and the man accused of commissioning Daphne's assassination, he was arrested in November of 2019 on his yacht as he tried to flee the country. He was released on bail just last year in February of 2025. There is no trial date set. 8.5 years since a car bomb killed a journalist on a small island where everybody knows everyone. 85% of journalist killings since 2006 remain completely unpunished. It is literally the reality that if you have enough money and power, you can order a killing and then just get away with it. That is the reality. That is genuinely the reality in the world. Maybe not so much in certain places, but in the world, averaged out, that is the reality. I'm a big fan of transparency, and I'm sure you are as well, and that brings us to the sponsor of today's episode. Just kidding. I have no sponsor in today's episode that has anything to do with transparency whatsoever, but I'm a big fan of it. And over the last year or 2 years, it's been like, with the American government. In March 2025, the US Treasury gutted the Corporate Transparency Act, which was the one federal law that would have required shell company owners to identify themselves by exempting every domestic company before the law took effect. So, that's awesome. 4 out of 5 countries tracked took no substantive regulatory action after the Panama Papers. Nothing has been done. Nearly 300 companies still share a single address in Wilmington, Delaware. I'm trying to add one of mine to that. Let's start a company, all of us. You guys can all be shareholders. We'll call it the Gump Club. All right, we'll call it Gump Corp, okay? Because we're all just Gumps. Appleby, the firm that incorporated Epstein's $6.7 billion Bermuda shell company, still in business. That's awesome. $3.5 trillion in assets. Nothing will ever be done. And there's nothing that we can do about it, unfortunately, guys. So anyways, Jarvis, more alcohol. Thanks for watching.